The quietest towns keep the loudest secrets, and I've got 3 of them. Places you won't find on a quick map search, places where the ordinary bends into something wrong, where helpful faces turn careful, and every ordinary sound feels like it's listening back. I've been chasing abandoned roads and half-scrubbed histories for years, with a camera and a friend who's learned to strap his nerves and laugh when the wind doesn't answer. What follows are 3 first-person accounts from those trips. Everything we saw, what the locals told us, and what the evidence did and did not show. I'll be honest where things go dark. I'll tell you when footage is gone, when the cops sealed a file, and when a friend simply stopped posting. If you like this kind of deep, slow creep investigation, stick around. Story 1 starts now. Story 1, Esther's Hollow. It started with a mechanic's offhand warning. Marvin was grease under his nails and a cigarette tucked into the corner of his mouth, wiping his hands on a rag like he was erasing the whole conversation. I was filling a gas tank, Aaron was tightening a tripod nearby, and Marvin said the name as if it tasted like rust, Esther's Hollow. He didn't point to it on a map. He only said, "You don't want to go there, kid." He told us the road stopped. The town had been a mine once, and that people there didn't answer the same way other people did. We went because that's what we do. Proof beats superstition, or at least that's the habit we keep telling ourselves. It was a long drive down a 2-lane that shrank to a single strip of tar and then to gravel. The sky was the kind of wide, flat gray that makes distances seem further. Aaron checked the camera. I checked the map on an old paper copy I keep for dead zones. And Marvin's half-buried roadside sign, white paint flaking, the name barely visible under moss, was the first thing that felt off in the open. The town itself was wrong in small ways that stack into a bigger wrong. There were no birds, not even the nervous sparrows that live in old power lines. The telephone poles leaned like old men, and the houses sat with their porches quiet, as if someone had paused and left. Dust motes hung in the light. The air had a chill that wasn't from the weather, an absence, heavy as a blanket. We parked under a sagging church steeple, and Aaron joked about haunted postcards. He always jokes first. I try to ignore it until the laugh dies. Inside the church, the pews were dusted as if someone had swept last week. The choir loft smelled faintly of smoke and lemon oil. On the pulpit's lip, someone had carved symbols into the wood. Not graffiti, deliberate, practiced marks, like alphabets of a private language. They were curved and intersecting, and the edges of each mark were darkened, as if rubbed by hands. It felt like being told to leave. We split up to cover ground. Aaron went down a side street and I kept to the main road, cataloging the storefronts. One house had plates set on a table, 3 chairs pushed in, and a roast in the center. It wasn't cold, not exactly. It was lukewarm, the edge of heat. The smell was there, faint under the dust, rich and oddly domestic. I called Aaron and his voice on the walkie said, quieter than normal, "You need to see this." He sounded like he'd seen something that was supposed to be an ordinary thing but didn't belong here. A plate with cutlery, a glass with a lipstick ring, a chair pulled out as if someone had left mid-meal. Then we heard the sound beneath everything else. A low, rhythmic chant. It was muffled, like people chanting in a room downstairs with the door on the latch. We followed it to the house with the warm table. There was a cellar hatch, the kind bolted with a simple iron hasp. It wasn't locked in a way we could fix with a screwdriver. It was intentional. Around the edge of the hatch, someone had drawn the same symbols we'd seen in the church, painted thin and black. The chant thickened. It was syllables, not words, held and repeated in a cadence that made the air vibrate against your teeth. We pried it open because we both have a stubborn curiosity and maybe a foolish belief that seeing is better than not knowing. The cellar smelled of damp cloth and old oil. A light was set on a workbench below, a single bulb in a shade that washed the room with a yellow so old it felt orange. Around that bulb stood a circle of people in robes. They had pieces of cloth stitched across their mouths like an X, rough fabric tied in patterns that made the fabric appear to be a permanent part of them. Their hands were slow. There was a young woman in the middle. She looked barely older than 20, bound at her wrists and with something across her mouth that was not gore but the kind of gag that turns sound into panic. Her hands were trembling. On a table nearby lay a curved blade, clean in a way that suggested it had been handled recently. I'll be honest, the first feeling was animal. Get back, run, move. We dove back up the hatch, scrambling for the steps, and as we slammed the lid behind us, the chant changed. It rose and then found a rhythm like pursuit. Down the street, lanterns flared at windows, and silhouetted figures moved with an unnaturally coordinated slowness. We ran for the car. Aaron's camera was in my bag, shaking, and when I reached for the keys, something grabbed my ankle. I turned and saw a robe brush my leg, slow and purposeful, trying to trip me. Aaron swore. We got to the road and took off. On the way out, the headlights picked out faces in the ditch, robed forms at the sides of the road, hands like roots pointing us along the way. One of them stepped into the lane and blocked us. I slammed on the brakes. The figure smelled of smoke and lemon oil, the same scent from the church, and when it moved its head, the stitched X over its mouth made a small, invisible sound. We rammed the road, and a dozen robed shapes followed like birds that fell from a sky that wasn't theirs. We drove until the road turned into gravel again and the radio found static. There's a stretch in stories like this where rational choices collapse into breath and speed. We flagged down a sheriff's cruiser at the county line, and the man behind the wheel, the sheriff, listened, quiet and professional, and then drove us back. He found them in the cellar, and a young woman was pulled free, coughing. Her gag had been cut. They took several people into custody. The sheriff said there were symbols elsewhere on property, and asked us not to get out of the car while they did their work. I remember Lena, that's the girl's name, collapsed into the sheriff's arms, and the way she kept blinking like she was catching up to the world again. Later, when the adrenaline drained, Aaron and I watched through the footage. The recording from downstairs, the steady camera work, the chant, gone. Aaron's files showed a brutal final cut. Footage present, then a file named with the date, then nothing. No corruption message, no half-saved frames, just empty space where our footage had been. He swore he hadn't deleted anything. I asked him later why he'd scrubbed it, and he told me he hadn't. The phone records showed our devices still with us that night. The sheriff declined to release images of the arrests beyond a single press photo of the cruiser lights outside the church. They charged several individuals with disorderly conduct and detainment, the sheriff said. The case file was, for reasons we weren't given, restricted. Months later, Aaron's drive showed the space where a full folder had been. He refused to talk about why he might have manually deleted anything. He said at first that a rogue file system had eaten the data. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. What I do know is that for all the people who were taken to jail and for the girl who was rescued, the carved marks and the scarf-stitched X's remained unexplained. The town's post office listed no residents. The map we had showed only a pin that said former town. If this kind of thing is the reason you keep coming back to these videos, hit subscribe and like. I'll keep bringing documented first-hand stuff like this. We left Esther's Hollow with Lena safe, that's the important part, and with a police report that ran out of answers before it reached a conclusion. Marvin went back to his shop and told customers nothing. The carved symbols remain in the church's wood. The X-mouthed robes were taken into custody, and yet the way the town sat, as if mid-breath, suggested there was more than arrests could fix. It's one thing to undo an action, another to undo a tradition. There are two things that stuck with me after Esther's Hollow. The first was the smell, lemon oil and smoke like somebody had tried to clean sin away. The second was the way the chanting didn't feel supernatural. It felt human, organized, rehearsed. You can believe what you like. I believe a lot of it points to human patterns. Secrecy, ritual, a small place protecting itself in the only way it knows. But the rest, the files gone, the quilts of stitched mouths, sit between the rational and the uncomfortable. Bridge. You notice a pattern if you live long enough with these kinds of places. People who seem like neighbors, warm and helpful, who then have locked doors and secret basements. The next story is about one of those helpers, a man named Eli, who offered shelter and chose domesticity as a trap. Story 2. Deerline Ridge Cabin. Whiteouts are the kind of thing that make you suddenly humble about timing. One minute you're on a highway with 20 cars and a radio DJ telling a bad joke. The next minute the sky folds down like a sheet and you can't see past the hood. We got trapped on the interstate. The plow trucks had turned back. I'd driven a long time that day. Aaron was asleep in the passenger seat until the first gust woke him. We crept off to a side road and saw a light in the distance. A small one, amber through falling snow. It was a cabin's window. A hand-painted sign in the verge said, "Rooms for rent," the letters wobbling like they'd been done by someone who was tired and precise. The man who answered the door called himself Eli. He was broad-shouldered and had the kind of voice that sounds like it knows how a house works. He led us to a room with a quilt and asked nothing about our vehicle. He offered stew and a place by the stove. Inside, it smelled almost exactly like home: thyme, wood smoke, and the bright edge of vinegar. We were grateful. We ate. We charged our phones to $1 each and joked about being the least prepared explorers in the channel. The cabin was friendly, but lived in the way that makes you want to touch things. His mugs were mismatched. The quilts were slightly sun-faded. The bookshelf had books about birds and manual farming. But the door to the basement had a heavy latch that made strange sounds when you walked past. It was bolted from the inside without explanation. Eli said nothing when we asked. When I pressed, he only smiled and said, "You don't need to worry about the downstairs tonight. It's best if it stays closed when winter comes in." The smile was patient. It was a line you sometimes hear from homeowners who mean, literally, that downstairs is being repaired. The smile is not a refusal. It's a soft shut. That night the house made human sounds. Not the creak of wood, more like a time when floors remember footsteps they've never had. There were shufflings under the floorboards that could have been mice, but the rhythm was too human. It sounded like someone whispering against their teeth. If you've ever been close to someone who's sobbing quietly with a hand over their mouth, you know the quality. Speech that tries not to be speech. The sound moved like it was understanding the boards themselves. A syllable under the oven, a half-breath near the pantry, a word stretched beneath the bedroom. Phones died. Mine hit 1%. The signal was gone. The car battery outside was a distant worry. We joked about how the farmhouse just sat us and intended to keep us a while, and I tried not to run my fingers across the latch. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the basement door's wood settling and the faint scrape of metal. The latch clicked. A hairline sound that suggests a lock turned, like a slow exhalation in a small room. I didn't wait. I went to a window and opened it. The glass was thick, old, studded with frost. I remember the sensation of cold pushing through the gap and the sound of my own breath loud in my ears. I pushed the sash as quietly as I could and dropped out into the snow, landing on my hands and knees in the white and feeling the immediate shocking clarity of the night air. I thought I'd wake Aaron and the two of us would slip off like thieves, but I met him at the side of the house halfway through the yard, face white and eyes wide. We walked. The sky was huge and empty, and the cabin looked at us through its single-lit window like a hearth that had noticed its flames had been stolen. A patrol cruiser found us on the side road. They were efficient and blank-faced. There was a discipline to their movements that suggested this wasn't their first winter rescue. They took us back to the cruiser and called the sheriff. When they went back to the cabin, they found signs that something in the basement had been recently handled, and evidence that the acts below had somehow led to the rescue of a missing person in a nearby town. The sheriff told us, politely but firmly, that some details would be withheld from public record because they were part of an ongoing investigation. He would not say more. Eli was gone. The door to the cabin was unlocked. There were boot marks in the snow leading away in a direction that wouldn't make sense unless you knew the smaller trails. The basement was a room of stacked boxes and equipment and a board with pins and notes, the sort of obsessive layout that could belong to a collector or a planner. I won't paint the room for you with details it would be wrong to invent. The sheriff told us only that they had found items in the basement that had contributed to the timely rescue of someone else. An official way of saying what we'd suspected, without telling us what had been done. Eli had disappeared like he always intended to sleepwalk out of the story. We drove with our phones dead and the image of the latch clicking under our teeth. The odd domestic signs in Eli's home, the sock draped over a chair, the half-mended quilt, the stack of National Geographics next to his bed, made the cabin feel like a person who invited you in and then withheld the rules. Was Eli a savior? A puppet master? A man whose ethics were a private ledger? The sheriff's refusal to say more felt like the town itself, deciding to keep its secret on behalf of the missing. The mutation in both stories is the same. When the ordinary rules break down, what's left is human intention. The latch that opens on its own could be a cracked hinge, or it could be a hand that knows how to keep a secret. The police did what they could. What they withheld was legal and deliberate. For us, the feeling remains. Someone somewhere was making choices we could not trace. The technology failed us, and the person who should have been accountable evaporated. Bridge. Technology doesn't just die at the worst moments by coincidence. It cuts, and files often have a way of closing questions we would rather not have answered. In the next story, the camera still works long enough to show you ordinary things that don't belong in a burned house, and then it fails in that particular way that turns memory into rumor. Story 3, Holland, the town that breathes. Silas was the reason we didn't completely blow past Holland. He showed up at my door with a notebook and a worn backpack, and this insistence on the leave no trace ethic so intense, it felt almost like a joke. He was finishing his anthropology degree, and had this careful way of looking at ruins, cataloging them and refusing the tourists' hunger to take souvenirs. We take photographs, leave footprints, he told me, and I liked his tone because it sounded like someone who believed in the work. Holland is on no tourist map. You pass a sign that says decommissioned and nothing else. The town's appeal, for people like Silas and the rest of us, is how intact it was. The mill was a skeleton. The high school had decrepit lockers, and the Main Street storefront windows were banded with soot from some old fire. The burned house we went to was half-frame and gutted in places, but when we ducked into the doorway, the noises of the world shut out like a fist. What made the house worse was the presence of the ordinary. In the front room, a crib sat in the corner with a pacifier clipped to its rail. A thermos on a side table sweated on a cold day as if someone had set coffee in it an hour ago. The bed upstairs was made, sheets tucked with a precision that suggests habit. You would expect those items in an occupied home. You would not expect them in a house that, from the street, looked like a husk. We moved slowly. Silas moved slower than I did, kneeling to examine scorch marks, photographing, then taking notes. He filmed a thermos and a pacifier and called it data like he was collecting a list for a thesis. "This implies someone came back," he murmured. The kind of deduction that sounds at once obvious and not. The house felt like a living thing. This is ridiculous to say, but it breathed. When you stood near the floorboards, you could hear an inhale and an exhale as if the building had lungs and the breaths came from between the joists. The air under the stairs held a reverberant echo, like someone whispering a long consonant and then waiting. We called it the house breathing to make it less scary. Names do that. They flatten the edges. At one point, we climbed into the upstairs bedroom, and the stairs beneath us seemed to shiver. For a strange second, the last step was there, and then it wasn't, like a trick of the mind, or a plank that had always been missing, and suddenly revealed itself as a phantom. A window on the second floor that we leaned against would not break. Aaron, always the practical one, picked up a rock and swung. The glass held like someone had bolted it to the frame with some unseen glue. It made the sound of glass that deepens and then holds. A thud more than a crack. We were not prepared for the smallness of the crawlspace. It was a gap under the house you could only enter on your stomach. We crawled in because the sound beneath the boards was becoming too articulate, like someone forming words with their breath but never letting them spill into the air. We hid under a corner and kept still. The closet above the crawlspace held coats that smelled faintly like a child's shampoo. We waited with our cameras aimed at the gap, the GoPro clicking a steady light. When we came out, the sun had moved a fraction too far for the time our watches told us. Our phones were confused. The GoPro files were intact at first, showing us crawling and a shadow that passed over the doorway. Then the footage corrupted into a smear of color and a single frame that looked like a hand smeared against glass. Silas watched the files, and his face went very pale. He made a sound like someone trying to swallow the word gone. The disappearance happened slowly and privately. At first, his posts on the forum where he shared his field notes went quiet. Then they were gone. His social media accounts were scrubbed clean. He untagged photos where he stood with his notebook next to me. The last message we saw from him, a private message, said he was going to keep his notes offline for a while. A thing an academic might say if they wanted privacy. I want to be precise. Nothing violent appeared on camera. Nothing gory. But the thermos, the pacifier, the made bed, those ordinary items function like a lie because they promise a domesticity the town could not logically support. Did people come back to Holland and try to live there? Did someone else put those things to make it look lived in? Or is there a kind of staging at work, a performance that you come to and are invited into? The footage decided not to answer for us. Corrupted files, a single smear where a hand might have been, and a friend who stepped out of line with the internet. We drove away with the sense that something had watched us leave. When we checked the cameras later, the raw files were a pattern of clean footage and then a single frame that was not recoverable. We sent copies to a friend tech who said it was beyond repair. The authorities were indifferent. They listed Holland as private property and suggested we not trespass. I'm not encouraging anyone to do otherwise. Take your photographs, leave your footprints. But know that sometimes footprints return to look at you. Conclusion. 3 towns. 3 different kinds of ordinary that turned menacing. Esther's Hollow with its carved church symbols, the robed figures with stitched X's, the girl named Lena, and the footage we lost. Deerline Ridge, a man named Eli who offered warmth and then a door that clicked on its own. A basement that somehow connected to someone else's rescue, and a host who vanished. Holland, where a burned house keeps a crib and a thermos, a house that breathes, stairs that vanish, a GoPro that refuses to tell the whole story, and a friend who removed himself from the world's records. What ties them together is not a single explanation. It's motifs, places off the map, evidence erased or corrupted, people who decline to be public, and rituals or preparations that look like community but read like concealment. There are human answers for a lot of the things we saw. Cult-like gatherings, planning, secrets told in rituals. But there are also technical failures and time shifts, and people who disappear from public view in ways that nothing in an arrest report explains. We were left with more questions than paperwork can file. I don't believe in miraculous conclusions, and I won't tell you I do. What I will say is this: the recorded evidence matters. The deleted files, the corrupted footage, the accounts that go silent. Those are footprints in their own right. They tell you there's a cost to knowing. Sometimes the cost is that you can't prove what you saw. Sometimes it's that the person you thought you could rely on in an empty house is the one who leads the dance. A quick note before you go: don't go trespassing on abandoned property trying to replicate any of this. It's dangerous, it's illegal in many places, and people get hurt. If you're curious, look for documented histories, public archives, and local forums where things can be discussed without you putting yourself at risk. Which one of these 3 got to you the most? The carved symbols in the church, the man who clicked his basement latch in the snow, or the house that breathes in Holland? Drop a comment and tell me which story stuck with you. If you want more videos like this, subscribe and check the playlist linked below. I've got more trips into quiet places and the strange things people do to keep a secret. See you in the next one, and keep your phone charged.